So a friend of mine told me a story. She was reading a book in a cafe, and then an elderly person sidled up to her and looked over her shoulder and said, "Have you noticed that the margins on books are getting smaller?" And then the person just enigmatically kind of wandered off into the shadows and disappeared. And that metaphor kind of became an important one to her, the sense in which the space around the edges of the body of text that has its thing to say used to be much bigger. People used to make notes in it and put their own thoughts around it in some sort of Talmudic fashion. And over time, the margins get smaller and smaller. The main message becomes the thing that dominates, and there isn't space for much else. I see a paradox these days in that there's cultural and political sort of reactionary energies that sort of seem to be almost wholly motivated by the anxiety that the margins are getting bigger, and the margins are spilling over our borders, and the margins are draining our welfare systems, and this anxiety that the margins are out to get us and they're going to kind of sink the boat. So we seem to be living in this sort of, I mean, the world always does, doesn't it? But there's a different character to it in every time, and there's the character of the tension between the margins and the main story at the moment feels like it's in some kind of humming point, some kind of crisis. I wanted to ask a bit about your many years of working in different marginal environments, and I mean, the thing I'm interested in is how have these, where have you been and how have you been changed by where you've been?
Mm-hmm. A thought comes to my mind about, I was studying for a couple of years in Paris in the late 1960s. And for anybody who knows a bit of the history of Paris in the late 1960s, it was a time of a lot of student unrest. It was a time when the Vietnam War was sort of struggling on, but those peace talks were beginning to develop about the Vietnam War, and they were taking place in Paris. And I was a student there. And I was asked in the final year to go and live with a religious community that was running a parish, was in charge of a parish in a poor quarter, Belleville of Paris, where Edith Piaf came from. And I turned up in this French parish. There was about 10 of them. It was a big community, and all French. And I was the struggling English student. And it was a wonderful experience, though, because half of the priests that lived there went out to work in a factory, and half of them were working on the parish. So that was interesting to start with. And I began to think, well, what's their thinking? Why do they actually go out to work in a factory? So I asked one of them one day, and I expected him to give me an answer saying, well, I go out into the factory because that's my way of getting to the workers who don't go to church, but I can take Christ, I can take the theology, I can take the gospel out to them, and that's why I make contact, is what I expected. But his answer shocked me at the time, and it was totally different, because he says, I think I go out, Nicholas, he says, because I'm trying to declericalize myself. And I found that quite a shocking statement at the time. I thought, well, what does he mean, declericalize himself? He's a priest, I'm a priest, we're here to do the best we can. And but it began to, the question sort of resonated with me and stayed with me, and I began to think more and more about it. And I began to think, well, yeah, I can see that there's a whole culture in following this way of life. You've taken on board far more culturally than you perhaps realise. It's not just the theology, it's not just the philosophy, it's your whole way of thinking. puts you into this, coming back to privilege in a sense. So I think that remained a constant sort of anxiety for me. And then over the subsequent years, I wasn't the only one feeling that. We'd had the whole experience in the Catholic Church of what we call the Vatican Council, which was an attempt, a quite serious attempt, to sort of say the Catholic Church has been a siege-like, in a fortress sort of a position. For goodness sake, why can't we open the doors? Why can't we open the windows? And there was a whole movement to do that. It generated a lot of enthusiasm and energy at the time. It was quite radical in this sort of very static sort of a Catholic tradition. And I suppose it was at that time that some of us began to say, well, for goodness sake, it's not just whether you go out and work in a factory, but are we in any way in contact with real people? Is the very monasticism, is the very sort of clerical status, is the way that we've been privileged? We might be doing our best, we might be going out and trying to preach, or we might be trying to encourage, but have we created a gap between us and the reality? Now, this is the 1970s. So, I mean, different world to where we are today. So that was when this friend of mine, Austin, who taught me philosophy, actually taught me a lot. He was older than me, and he said, I'm going to ask, can we step outside our church, monastic setup, Passionist setup, and go and live in an inner city? The inner city was the term in the 1970s, which would be the shorthand for saying that's where the problems are, or where the people are, struggling. So it's a long story, because what he was asking was seen by the Passionist community as something. What on earth is he doing that for? We've got a perfectly good monastery here. Why is he wanting to go out? He can go out and talk to them if he wants, but come back in. So it took some negotiating to get to that point, and he didn't want to go on his own. And he said, would I go with him? So I said, yes, I would. So that was when I was back from Paris then, and that was when I went to live in Toxteth, and that's when I would say, great as my education system had been before then, and for which I'm very grateful, I really think I only began to learn properly from October 1971, where I was then. We didn't have a church, we didn't have anything of the normal trappings of church. We didn't quite know what we were going to do, other than that we wanted to go and live there. It was a radical repositioning of ourselves to rethink what being Passionist means in that sort of context. And that has then developed in different ways, and it's sort of. But those would be two factors that were. One of them was that incident in Paris, which is okay. That was just momentary. But the other one was, it was a commitment to sort of say, no, let's begin from another starting point.
Mm-hmm. I've got I've got friends, a group I'm involved in, who, inspired by Alistair MacIntyre's book, After Virtue, have been exploring the idea that we need a new, we need a rule. They're not a Catholic group, although there'll be some Catholics involved. It's a very mixed group. But we need a rule of life. We need almost that, that desert fathers moment where we flee from society to marginal space to form things out of the truth. The first place my mind went was to a speech by a Native American activist called Russell Means, where he says that European revolutionary ideologies, capitalism, Marxism, Christianity, he mentions those three, are revolutionary in their own minds. But if you're not European, it just amounts to the same thing. It's just another way of, it's just succession. It's just continuation of what was. And the only way to judge a European revolutionary ideology is by looking at its effects on non-European peoples. That's a very big scale statement of the problem, of the issue, of the question. But it's revealing to me the notion that, well, inside the city walls is the realm that you've made, and to the extent that you've made it, it's a fiction. outside the city walls is the truth about what the city does and what it takes. So I think there is this sort of revelatory moment where we realise that, or that goes from our head to our heart, normally through some experience or being evangelised by the other, as your friend Martin Neal put it to me. But that's very difficult to do, isn't it? That stays in our heads much longer.
Yeah.
Well, I should say for me, maybe not so for yourself. That stayed in my head for a lot longer than it should have before it found its way into my experience. Our journey out of our world and into another world really involves picking up our body and putting it in the space of another. I'm wondering if that something about your journey and your place and position seems to have. It sounds like you had to be very intentional about making that happen. It sounds like there was struggle involved in it, but it also sounds like where you were facilitated that journey. I'm wondering if being a priest in an order made it harder or easier for you to put your body in the space of the other and begin to be a recipient of the truth as you received it from them.
Yeah. Well, I think, obviously I can only speak out of my own experience, so I don't know what it might have been like from another point of view, but certainly I found it was a tremendous support to belong to a religious order, because I felt that however confused I was arriving at this new liminal space, I knew I was coming, perhaps reluctantly, given permission to come, but I was coming from a community that was supporting me. So that was a strength. And it was a community that was supporting me without at the same time imposing, although there were attempts at times, to impose what happened in that new space. So there was a creative tension about where we were coming from, and an attempt to communicate that, not always successfully in terms of what the new experience was being, but the very fact that there was that lifeline, and that it wasn't it wasn't a journey just on our own. That did give confidence. The fact that there were two of us together, so we were both committed individually, but we were also committed to one another. So that was a tremendous strength. It wasn't always easy. Again, Austin was a man that, very creative man who I loved deeply, but he wasn't always necessarily the easiest person to live with, as creative people aren't always. So it wasn't just as it were, and we were both strong people in the sense of like we would argue our case. So there was a deep commitment, but it wasn't one that you could just take for granted. It had to be worked out. So the conversation would again come in. I think we were very fortunate in terms of the particular community we eventually ended up in, namely Toxteth, because there's something special about that community. In many ways, it's similar to other inner city communities, but there's a long history there. It's the oldest black community in the UK, possibly similar to Cardiff, because of it being a port. So it was a community that was settled, and yet the community itself, because it was mostly black, wasn't free in the way that anybody else in Liverpool was free. So the community was having to cope with the tension of how it survived, how it lived, whatever. So you've got those different sort of points of contact, which I found were the creative sort of lifelines along the way. So we received an awful lot from the local community when we were feeling low, or where the hell is this going, or what are we doing here? You know, there was a reassurance. The tension would be there the whole time, where challenging me to sort of say, well, is the way I'm speaking, is the way I'm acting really at the service of this group or these people or this individual, or am I fulfilling my own need to be wanted or whatever? So that awareness that you were in a privileged but fragile position, which could easily be destroyed, because a community like Liverpool 8, like Toxteth, is ultra suspicious, rightly so, of do-gooders, as they might put it, or professionals coming in and sort of like parachuted in and sort of saying, oh, we'll help solve your problems. So in order to maintain an authentic relationship with them, you would really have to sort of be careful that you meant what you said in terms of like, I want to work alongside you. There was an example of where when the riots were on in 1981, and there was all the tension with the local police and everything, and there were different groups were formed to sort of help the community. And there was one occasion when Austin, who was better known than me in that sense, he had his own particular gifts, and the local community said to Austin, listen, we've arranged a meeting with the chief constable and council and whoever. We need somebody to chair it. Will you chair it? So Austin said, yeah, sure, if you want me to do it, I will. But he says, before I go in, I says, let me know, you tell me what the terms of reference are, what you want to see happen. This is to the black community who were asking him to do it. There's an authenticity when the chips are down and when things are at an ebb. Don't come in, no matter how articulate or how much you want to, and so say you're going to say what the way forward is.
There's something about allowing oneself to be interrupted by the vision of another, the thing that's clear to another person but not clear to me,
Yes.
or the thing that's screamingly loud to another person but had been trivial to me.
Yeah.
And of like,
Yes.
you grab hold of your initial reaction of
Yeah.
of why is that such a big deal,
Yeah.
to, well, maybe I need to ask myself, why is it not a big deal?
Yeah.
I think a paradigm shift for me probably occurred years ago when I got very involved in the No More Page 3 campaign. So it was a campaign against the way women are represented in the Murdoch press. And I suppose, I was working for an evangelical organisation at the time. I always had leanings into sort of various activist activities. I guess I felt ethically, politically, prayerfully compelled to be involved, to join, to lend my voice. And it put me into a dialogical space with lots of people outside my evangelical world, with many more women than men, a space where women were the leading voices. It turned the volume up on lots of awareness that I'd had in
Yes.
to some degree, but that was, it was there, but not that important.
Yes. Yeah.
Things that were not important to the in my normal circle, my normal community. Things that were sort of outright challenging my worldviews on many kinds of things, and those connections, relationships, exposures to sufferings that I hadn't experienced, lead from one thing to the next, and I guess there's a journey in that.
Yes.
A journey of
Awareness
and relinquishment.
Yeah. And you've got to be sort of on the qui vive, as it were. You've got to be ready to sort of notice them, because it's easy to miss them. A couple of quick examples of like where specific things for me stick in my mind. There was a group of kids I'd taken during the time when there were disturbances on in 1981. We'd taken them to Holyhead actually, and given them a break away from the problems. And we were having a debate in the morning with them, and there was one lad in particular, and would say, well, shall we do this or shall we do that? And his inevitable answer would always be, I'm not bothered. And I kept offering him alternatives, and he said, I'm not bothered. I said, listen, Darryl, I said, just let's have a straight conversation. Why do you always say, I'm not bothered? And he says, well, if I tell you that I am bothered, you've got power to sort of decide yes or no. And I thought, he was about 13 at the time. And I thought, never crossed my mind, in terms of his analysis of where that was. Another example was where with myself and the other teacher that I worked with, we had this sort of group that we'd formed in the school. And whenever there was a problem, we would always say, well, okay, there's a problem. How are we going to solve it together? And we'd call a meeting, there'd be a conversation, and sometimes it worked out and sometimes it didn't, whatever. But there was this particular occasion, I can't remember what the problem was, but there was an intense debate going on with this group of 8, 9, 10 teenagers. And the two of us were there, and they weren't inhibited by us being there. But in the end, one of them said, listen, will you two go and stand outside the classroom? Because we want to solve this one ourselves. We'll call you back in when we've sorted it. So we found ourselves in the we were in a comprehensive school, and she was a senior teacher. I was in the school. And we found ourselves stood outside the classroom, hoping to God that the head teacher or any of the other staff weren't going to sort of walk past us. I said, why have they been sent out of the classroom? Meanwhile, it sounds as if all hell was breaking loose inside. But eventually, 10 minutes, whatever, afterwards, you can come back in now. And they'd solved it. Forget the details. The reason it comes to mind is because it is about power. It's about being aware of your power, about when to let go of that, or when to enable others to take that power. And that's not an easy one, because it's got all sorts of political and personal and institutional and professional relationships connected to it, in a sense, you know. But I think it goes to the heart of what we've been talking about today in terms of where is God in the middle of all this, and where is the sharing, and where is the... Somehow, I'm wandering a bit there.
That's a beautiful example of the paradox of being present in a marginalised space, but also standing aside in it. You know, allowing its voice to surface and not your own.
Yeah.